let me begin with the word. I think all of us are accustomed to and have heard creation stories that begin with light, with primal sound. But today is not a story about the creation of the world or the universe. It's about the creation of stories, about the sources and inspirations for creativity in fiction writing. I'm tossing up a cover of one of our issues of Out of Print magazine, the magazine I run for short stories, to remind you that we are talking about the story. Let me return to the word. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, and I'm sure I'll end up paraphrasing somewhat, but according to the Oxford English Dictionary, the word is a single, distinct unit, an element of speech and of writing. Words have meaning. They can have explicit significance, or they can have implicit significance. Like all of you, I probably end up interpreting words either in a direct and literal fashion, or I use my imagination to get at the meaning of a word. I know that it's often difficult for an audience to have reams of text on a screen, and so I am going to loop through a series of images that are art created by Olivia Fraser that we used in Out of Print in September 2017, just to entertain you, so if I get a little boring, you have some beautiful things to look at. We were talking about words and one's understanding of words. My understanding of words is, of course, influenced by my background. It's influenced by my childhood, which gave me an exposure to multiple languages, to a nuanced interaction of different cultures. It gave me a belief and a hope in the ideals of plurality and secularism, which is how I grew up, and that naturally influences the way you interpret and understand words. My work in science has impacted the way I think about words. By immersing myself in my research, I've come to respect precision and specificity. And my understanding of words is, of course, impacted by my work as a writer, which gives me the ability, the gift almost, one might say, of being able to communicate and of being able to put the imaginings in one's head into story form. Now, why am I talking about all of this? Of course, I've already told you that I'm interested in the sources, the inspirations of creativity. Why does a writer write? What drives a writer to write? But I'm also trying to give you a context of why and how I came to talk about what I'm going to share with you today. Outside out. When I was presented with the theme of today's TEDx seminar, I was thrown into a whirlwind of thought. Outside out, what does that mean? Outside out, thinking beyond the outside. Outside out is extending the boundary. But what is that boundary? Is it a line, a Lakshman Rekha that we cross at our peril? Is it a set of walls, like politicians today seem so eager to construct to separate us? Is it a frontier, a space frontier, extending our imaginations, opening up larger perspectives? To me, actually, because of my work in science, the idea of the boundary moved from the infinite down to the microscopic, from the rarefied to that most dense and sophisticated of conglomerates, the living cell. The boundary of the living cell is this amazing entity, the biomembrane. And I worked on the biomembrane as a scientist. And what the membrane does is it holds the cell and protects it. It prevents it from imploding upon itself. It prevents it from exploding. It prevents it from disintegrating and dissipating its contents. This incredible entity, the biomembrane, not only contains the cell, holding life itself, but it permits communications across its barriers. It's semi-permeable, a selectively porous membrane, a selectively porous fabric. Human beings are ultimately self-centered. And so you take that idea of something that is holding and protecting a unicellular system, and you transpose it to yourself, a multicellular entity, and you think of fabrics, of garments, of kurtas, of shawls, of capes, of coats, garments that hold and protect you. But most of these garments are reversible. You can turn them inside out and reveal the interior, expose the interior. So you have inside out, outside in, reversibility, exposure. And you layer on top of that the idea of porosity, and you end up with outside out. She's just playing with words, you're saying to yourselves, I can tell. Well, isn't that what writers do? You play with words, you transpose ideas onto phrases, you tell stories. So permit me this, outside out. So what does outside out mean to a writer? What does that idea of raw exposure really mean to a writer? Let me step back and pose an often investigated question, perhaps even an overly explored question, and ask, how autobiographical is fiction? Does a writer put herself, her experiences, into her writing? And I think the answer is complex, it's multidimensional, and simply it is yes, no, and everything in between. I myself tend to do that. I do put myself into my writing in the sense that often my stories are triggered by my own experiences and observations. So in a story that I wrote called Disappearing Act, that was published in a magazine called Dead Housekeeping, it's a story of an elderly man who's suffering from some kind of old age disease, senility, dementia. And it was triggered by my driving every day past this elderly gentleman who lived under the flyover in Bombay. And he was clearly relatively well cared for. He wore a fresh dhoti every day. And, but he was clearly not very well, often very agitated. And it brought to mind various stories about people I knew or had heard of who were in similar situations, and also their caregivers. So all of these tales wove together to create this new story that I called Disappearing Act. These stories are, of course, based on various real life episodes, observations, experiences, but they're not about me. They're really just my emotional responses to various things that take place. Now, Kiran Nagarkar, in his latest book, Jasoda, he opens it with an extraordinary episode. A woman is giving birth. It's a very difficult, yet a very caring birth. The child is born. She determines its gender, it's a girl, and she crushes it to death between her thighs. Now, clearly that's not an autobiographical story. I mean, Kiran Nagarkar didn't have this experience himself, but he's had an emotional response, an extremely controlled response to episodes he might have heard of, read about. He is from having a reaction to society and creating a fictional character who then carries forward this story. Let's turn now to the writing of Meena Kandasamy. In her latest book, When I Hit You, she writes about a young marriage. It's about a brutally abusive one. The husband is an academic, a university professor. The wife, the narrator, is a writer. In early 2012, Meena wrote an article, a real-life article, in Outlook magazine, talking about her own brutally abusive marriage that was both psychologically and physically abusive. It takes a great deal of courage, surely, to write about something like that. Omer Ahmed interviewed her recently, and he asked her, wouldn't people think that the novel is about you? And she clarified that it really is a fictional novel, but it's shamelessly, quote unquote, informed by her own experiences. It takes courage, as I said, but it also takes a great deal of craft to tell a story that is about yourself and transform it into fiction. The story is extremely well structured. The novel is very finely written and also very finely edited, and clearly took a great deal of control to create. Did. But I'll move instead to a question that I asked myself, and for this I throw up a quote from Marguerite Duras that I will leave you to read. But the question is, how conscious is that crafting of oneself into a story? And to talk about that, I'll talk about a young scriptwriter called Radha Sundar. And she told me that recently she wrote a script that was turned into a film by someone else. And when she saw the film, she realized that in fact one of the central characters was based on someone extremely close to her. And she hadn't been aware of that while writing it. So I think as you progress in your writing, as you proceed with your craft, you begin to create that awareness in an extremely conscious, aware, and significant fashion. I'm going to slowly come to the end of this talk, which was about creativity. It was about putting oneself into one's writing. It was about the inspirations for writing. And for this conclusion, I will throw up another quote from Marguerite Duras that's quite complex, and again that I shall leave you to read. But the one point that I shall make about it is, when you ask a writer, when you ask her why she writes, what drives you to write, she talks about perforating the darkness, entering into one's inner self. In her case, of course, it's darkness, it's Dura, but I think ultimately one writes to dream. And I throw up a slide from Out of Print magazine that I think is quite revealing. One writes in order to support each other, in order to build community, and that you'll see, hopefully, in the next slide. You write to resist. All of these things are so important in today's day and age. And ultimately, you write to tell stories outside out. Thank you.